Welcome everyone here at the Capitol Hill Visitor Center on behalf of the project for Middle East Democracy, on Middle East Democracy, and the Heinrich Böll Foundation North America. My name is Sebastian Gräfe. I run the foreign policy program of the DC office of the German Heinrich Böll Foundation. We are one of the German political foundations, and we can be compared with NDI or IRI. We have 30 offices worldwide, 4 of them meanwhile in the region in North Africa and the Middle East. And one of the things that distinguishes us from IRI and NDI is that we have strong German accent, of course. Yeah. So this is actually, I think, Steve or Cole can correct me, but I think it's the 5th edition of the budget report, and I think I would like to take this also as an opportunity to congratulate you, POMED, and especially you, Steve, for this work. And it has been a pleasure for us, Böll, to work with you on this project for the last 5 years, and to have you as a partner who has long-term interest in democracy promotion and human rights and doesn't do just one publication, one event, and then moves on. Yeah, so congrats. I also want to thank all your staff, Cole and Anna, and all those who I forgot to mention for organizing that event. Before handing over to Cole Pockenfeld, who will moderate that event, let me just say that it is, I think, one thing to discuss democracy promotion and financial assistance with regimes, with authoritarian repressive regimes, and it's a different discussion. It should be a different discussion when we talk about democracy assistance and financial assistance to countries in transition, and I think we will discuss about those differences probably here today. I mean, just one election doesn't make a democracy, and I think that's why democracy promotion in countries like Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya requires other instruments and other means than in countries with authoritarian regimes. So with that, I leave it to Cole to moderate the event, and thanks again.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Sebastian, for your comments. And as you noted, this is the 5th year for this report, so we're very excited to bring it to you all again this year. Particularly because this year's budget, we feel, takes on some extra importance. That this year, with the administration's request, it's the first time that takes into account the historic uprisings that we've been watching for the past 18 months. So it's a key indicator to see what kind of priorities the administration is looking at, what kind of changes they've made, and so on to react to events in the region. We think one of the reasons this report is particularly important is because a lot of discussion about U.S. policy and reacting to issues of democracy and human rights in the Arab world is really focused a lot on the public statements of U.S. officials, as we've seen from the recent visit of Secretary Clinton and other officials to the region, and also the perceived use or lack of diplomatic pressure and leverage. But much less discussion revolves around the types of funding and assistance programs and what sort of impact that has on these issues in the region. And finally, we think this conversation is really important to have right here on the Hill, because as I mentioned before, a lot of the discussion is focused on those public statements and diplomacy, but particularly on funding questions. This is an area where Congress really has the highest impact on the trajectory of events in the region. So with this year's report, again, we want to look at some basic observations of how things have changed from previous years, both in terms of funding assistance, types of funding to different countries, but also the trends and what that indicates about the priorities and how the administration is reacting in terms of its assistance to the region. So I think I'll go ahead and introduce our speakers briefly before turning it over to Steve to talk about the report a little bit more. Steve McInerney is POMED's executive director. as Sebastian said, is his 5th year authoring this report. And I should note that this isn't really just a description of the numbers themselves and kind of raw data and statistics. But Steve also does quite a bit of interviews with democracy practitioners, officials in the administration and Congress, so on, to give context to what these numbers mean. And he can talk a little bit more in detail about what that looks like. Next, we'll go to Tamara Wittes, who right now is the Senior Fellow and Director of the Saban Center for Middle East Policy at Brookings. She just recently returned back to the NGO world. Previously, she was serving as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs at the State Department, and particularly oversaw the Middle East Partnership Initiative there. So we'll offer some comments in particular about her thoughts on the Middle East and the type of historic changes underway and how the administration has responded to that. Finally, we'll conclude with comments from Jennifer Windsor. She's the Associate Dean for Programs and Studies at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown. Before she joined Georgetown a couple of years ago, she served for 10 years as the Executive Director for Freedom House, and before that worked at USAID, serving as Deputy Assistant Administrator and Director of the Center for Democracy and Governance. So it can offer some comparative examples during that time, in particular of how USAID reacted with their assistance and funding questions to openings for democracy in Eastern Europe and so on. So with that, I'll turn it over to Steve.
Okay. Thanks, Cole. So as has been mentioned, this is the 5th year in a row that I've written this report. A lot has sort of changed during those 5 years, both in terms of what's happened in the Middle East, in terms of prospects for democracy, governance, political reform, human rights, and certainly in terms of U.S. policy and also in terms of U.S. assistance. The first couple of years that I wrote this report, programs were not necessarily that dynamic, not changing that much. There were some, with occasional exceptions, there were kind of steady increases in some places, modest decreases in others. Obviously, the past 18 months have seen quite dramatic, kind of unprecedented events in the region. And inevitably, in reaction to that, there's been more dramatic changes to U.S. assistance and funding than was the case prior. Cole mentioned that this report doesn't just look at kind of numbers and data, and I would kind of add to that I think this year and now looking at assistance, the numbers alone tell the story even less completely than they used to, and they've never told the complete story. But kind of numbers now can almost be misleading, and there's a little bit more difficulty for me in trying to kind of present things in accurate ways. You'll see in the report that there are a number of graphs and tables and such. I would caution from drawing too much from those, and the kind of narrative description in the text I think often gives a better impression, and I elected in the country sections. There are individual country sections for 8 key countries in the region, and in a couple of those countries, I decided to remove the bar graphs and pie charts that we've always included in the past and included for other countries because I thought they were misleading, and I'll come back in a moment and kind of or that they would be misleading or hard to do in a kind of accurate way that's reflective of the reality. So I'm going to just go through kind of some of the highlights, most important kind of observations and conclusions from putting this report together. As Cole mentioned, I've had a lot of conversations over the last several months with administration officials here in Washington, also members of the democracy promotion community, different democracy promotion organizations, human rights organizations here in the States, and then also with a lot of our contacts in the region, especially. And I actually just got back 2 days ago from a trip to Tunisia, Libya, and Egypt, and I've had a number of other trips, and I've had a lot of meetings in those places with democracy advocates, civil society leaders locally, and then also with U.S. officials at embassies and USAID missions, and all of that has kind of informed the conclusions that you'll see in the report here. I guess the first thing I would say in terms of conclusions and observations about the administration's approach is that it's been uneven somewhat, and I'll go into more detail kind of country by country. I think there are some places in which the administration's approach has been quite strong, and they deserve a lot of credit. There are other places in which that's not the case. I'd say in in a few words, in the countries that are undergoing transitions now, and General Administration is doing a very admirable job of mobilizing resources and adapting funding and responding to local demands, and doing so in a kind of difficult, constrained budget environment. Where the overall funding for international affairs has been decreased and cut by Congress. Nonetheless, they've done an impressive job of responding to the political transitions, particularly in Tunisia, and then I would say also in Libya, and then most recently in Yemen, where the response in Yemen has been a little slower to come than in Tunisia or Libya. I think they deserve credit for the way they're responding there. Most of the countries, of course, in the region, this report looked at about 20 countries, the standard countries in the Middle East and North Africa. Most of those countries, of course, are not undergoing political transitions at this point. And I would say in general, there's been not that much change to the U.S. approach in most of those countries. And on one hand, that shouldn't be that surprising. On the other hand, I think there was sort of a promise that the approach in these countries would be different. And there were a number of speeches given last spring by President Obama and Secretary Clinton, in which very bold, forward-looking, sort of ambitious goals were laid out, and ambitious statements of U.S. policy. President Obama declared in May of last year that that support for democratic principles would no longer be a secondary interest. He sort of made clear that it would be a top priority of the United States on par with other interests across the region, and the democratic principles would be supported, quote, with all of the diplomatic, economic, and strategic tools at our disposal. And I think in a few countries that has been the case. I think for most of the countries, I think it would be hard to argue that sort of lofty shift in policy has been achieved. To maybe say a bit more about some of the specific individual countries, I mentioned in brief, I think the administration deserves really a lot of credit for their response in Tunisia. They've really responded quite a bit to local demand in terms of mobilizing resources. Tunisia is a country that didn't have much of a bilateral aid package, at all before the uprisings, before 2011. As a result, it was a little bit slow to mobilize resources. When we had this discussion a year ago, the administration had clearly responded much more quickly in Egypt than in Tunisia, and that was in large part because in Egypt there was a large bilateral stream of funds in which funds could be easily reprogrammed. Tunisia didn't have that, and it made the response slower. But now, sort of 18 months after the uprisings began, the administration has mobilized quite a bit of resources, in the neighborhood of 440 million from a wide variety of different accounts and funds, global and regional funds, to support Tunisia's transition. In some sense, Tunisia has been somewhat of an easier case. There's not, sort of some of the same kind of complicating political factors or tensions that we find in Egypt or elsewhere. And I think so, but I think the administration deserves credit for kind of recognizing and not overlooking it. There was a moment last spring where Tunisians and others kind of watching Tunisia were afraid that it would be kind of forgotten and neglected. After a brief moment in January where all the world's eyes were all on Tunisia, and then for about 2 weeks, and then revolutions erupted in Egypt and Bahrain and Syria and Libya and across the region, Tunisians were afraid that they'd be forgotten about. And I think the administration deserves credit for trying to really seize an opportunity in Tunisia and support their transition. So Tunisia is a place that the administration sees as kind of welcoming support, which is not the case in some of the other countries. It's also a country with a relatively small population where relatively modest level of resources can have a real impact. And so I'd give them a lot of credit for their response there. Libya, somewhat similarly, the administration has mobilized, in FY11 funds mobilized $140 million to Libya. By now, it's the total figure is closer to $200 million. In general, they're again kind of responding to kind of local demand and trying to support Libya's transition in somewhat different ways. Because the needs are different and the kind of economic needs in Libya are not exactly the same with the resources and such that they have. And then I mentioned briefly that in Yemen, the response in Yemen I think has come more slowly. But just here in recent weeks, there have been several announcements of additional funds for Yemen, And in all, we've seen something like 300 million, mobilized for Yemen. And actually, there was just an article, and there have been several articles lately and several announcements lately. And USAID Administrator Shah traveled out recently to Yemen and made a big announcement of some additional humanitarian aid. There's actually an article this morning in the Washington Post about some additional military aid that's been going to Yemen. So in general, it seems now, although it's come a bit late, that they are trying to be quite supportive in Yemen. As I mentioned, around a lot of the rest of the region, there haven't been that much of dramatic changes, and I think it's been somewhat disappointing to see, support for democratic reform and democracy and governance programming not become more of a priority in a number of the countries. I'd also add to that there are some countries in the region where it seems as though, in the past year, the priority in supporting serious political reform has actually decreased. And I would point to Lebanon and the Palestinian territories. And in both of those places, I don't think that the kind of diminished interest in supporting democracy and governance is directly a result of kind of the uprisings or the big picture changes in the region. I think they're more attributable to kind of local dynamics and sort of the result of trends that have been ongoing for a few years in each of those two places. But nonetheless, I think it's sort of disturbing to not see that kind of counteracted by the kind of big picture in the region and the larger commitment to supporting reform. And then a third place that I see sort of diminished increase in supporting democracy and governance is really the entire Gulf, the GCC states. And it's never really been our top priority there, but it's a place that MEPI has had some programming, DRL has had some programming. And I think the decreased interest now is really a response to pushback from the governments in the Gulf. And that, with the uprisings in the region, the changes in the region, and to some degree the role of civil society in bringing about these changes, certainly the governments in the Gulf don't want to see these kind of changes at home. And they have been more aggressive in pushing back against democracy promotion organizations. The government of the United Arab Emirates, for example, has closed the office of the NDI and Konrad Adenauer foundations. And in a number of countries in the Gulf, some programming has either ended recently or looks as though it will end soon. And that seems to be, as I said, a kind of result of kind of giving into the pushback of some of the governments there. I haven't mentioned yet Egypt, so I'll say a few words about Egypt. One thing that, over the 5 years of writing this report, lots and lots have changed, and this report looks very different from the report 3 or 4 or 5 years ago. One thing that I think hasn't changed is I think all 5 years that I've written this report, the longest country section has been on Egypt. And for different reasons every year, but Egypt has sort of always been the country that's really at the center of a lot of the most controversial and interesting debates about U.S. assistance, and that's been true for a long time. And with the changes in the revolution and such, that remains the case. U.S. assistance and support, in general, U.S. assistance to Egypt is, I think, right now more uncertain than it has been in decades. I think, and that applies to both the support for democracy and governance funding, which obviously is very much sort of uncertain and in doubt as you all likely know. There was quite a controversy this spring that continues with a number of democracy-promoting organizations, including 4 U.S.-based organizations, having come under attack and having criminal charges brought against their staff. And those charges remain. And at this point, the trial has been postponed, I believe, until September. And that kind of sort of sparked a real crisis in the U.S.-Egypt relationship. That came this spring at a time where Congress had put conditions on the $1.3 billion in military aid to Egypt, which required the Secretary of State to either certify that a number of conditions regarding the democratic transition had been met, or she had the authority to waive those conditions if deemed in the U.S. national security interest. This was the same sort of similar scenario that we had several years ago in the last year of the Bush administration. But obviously with much more attention and kind of controversy this year because of the changes in the revolution and the transition underway. The administration did this spring elect to waive the conditions. They certainly would have not been able to certify that the Egyptian government had met those conditions. And I think that decision, sent. I think it was sort of poorly handled, poorly done. I think it sent a signal to many in Egypt that the U.S. was not willing to kind of really stand behind a lot of its rhetoric about supporting the democratic transition. I think that I think that decision often was portrayed as sort of a black and white decision about giving all the aid or cutting it all, and the reality is I think there were lots of kind of other options in between, and where the aid could have just been held up, and statements could have been made that the administration wanted to deliver the aid, and it would as soon as the conditions had been met, and hopefully that would be the case after the elections. And perhaps if that stance had been taken, then maybe we wouldn't have seen some of the same steps that we've seen since to kind of derail the transition and kind of take power for the military to take power back from some of the elected institutions, both the parliament and the president. So moving forward, there's a lot of questions about the future of U.S. Military aid to Egypt, as well as democracy and governance aid. The administration right at this moment seems to be focusing most in Egypt, on kind of the other part of aid, which is kind of aid to support Egypt's economy, which of those three types seems to be sort of the least controversial. Secretary Clinton was just in Egypt over the weekend, and kind of we seem to be focusing more on trying to support the economy. Related to the aid to Egypt, I wanted to mention the fact that while there was a lot of debate and discussion last year about possibly kind of rebalancing some from military aid to economic aid, both in Egypt and more broadly across the region, and that Senator Kerry and others early last year kind of raised the possibility of kind of shifting some military aid to economic aid, which on the surface seems like as though it would make sense. The overwhelming majority, about 80% of bilateral aid from the U.S. to the Middle East and North Africa goes to militaries as in the form of military aid at a time where the U.S. budgets, where there's not lots of extra funds available to provide, needed economic support. It seems as though that would make sense. One thing I think that we've seen quite clearly over the past year is that the structure of a lot of the military aid makes it very difficult to kind of shift or realign aid. And I think while on the surface it would make sense to kind of shift some of this aid around, we've seen kind of real resistance to this. And on one hand, a lot of the military aid to the region is governed by kind of long-term, multi-year contracts, where the economic aid, for the most part, is done kind of 1 year at a time, with a couple of exceptions. But it makes it much more difficult to kind of shift things around. We also saw this spring when the administration was kind of seriously thinking about kind of holding off and holding up Egypt's military aid. We saw the influence of a lot of the domestic U.S. Defense manufacturers and weapons manufacturers. Most of the military aid is given to Middle Eastern governments is then used to purchase U.S.-made equipment and weaponry. The contracts are structured in such a way that weapons manufacturers were able to reach out to members of Congress and say, if this aid is held up or cut off, then this is how it will affect us, and this is how many jobs, the American jobs will be lost. I think in general, there's a real need to sort of seriously look at kind of the structure of military aid to the region, and maybe kind of make some changes so that in the future, if for national security reasons or for reasons of U.S. policy, if there's a desire to shift some of this aid, I think we ought to now kind of begin trying to find ways to make it more flexible, so that we could so that changes could be made more quickly, in the event that it was needed. One last country that I would mention that I didn't, the one country that is aside from the ones that are undergoing political transitions currently, where I think we've seen real increased interest and support for democracy and governance, is Jordan. And I think that's very welcome. I think I've been critical sometimes in these reports and otherwise in the past that the U.S. Has not been more interested in supporting reform in Jordan. Jordan is a place where quite clearly over the past year, the thinking of the embassy and of the administration about Jordan has sort of taken seriously the fact, the need to see reform there, and I hope that will continue. So I'll leave my remarks there. I didn't go into a lot of detail in terms of numbers and such, but they are in the report. But look forward to taking any questions.
Great, thank you. Go on, Tamara.
Well, thanks, Steve, and thanks to POMED and Heinrich Bull for putting this together. I find this annual review an incredible resource, both before I went into government when I was trying to do my own work tracking U.S. democracy and governance support in the region, and then in government, knowing that there were folks outside who were paying attention. This is a real public service that you do every year, Stephen. I know it's a tremendous amount of work. It's very comprehensive. It's very thoughtful and careful. And I really want to commend you for making the investment to do this. I'm going to try and make just 3 or 4 broad comments, but since you highlight Tunisia as a relative success story for the administration, I thought maybe I would just start a little bit with that, because in some ways Tunisia, the Tunisian case, represents the starkest example of what the Obama administration really had to face in dealing with the challenge of finding funding to support democratic transitions in the region. It's January 14th. Ben Ali gets on a plane and leaves the country, and we're facing a country where we had a $2 million bilateral assistance account. I mean, it was really minimal, doing a very small set of things because the Ben Ali government simply didn't allow for much real engagement by the U.S. government with society or with development issues in that society. We also had a handful of MEPI local grants in Tunisia and one of MEPI's 2 regional offices in Tunisia. So January 14th, we had $2 million in bilateral aid. A year later, the administration had nearly $200 million in aid to Tunisia. And I think that that's really, given the budget environment we were facing, given the trade-offs involved, and given the speed of events, it was quite remarkable that we managed to put that together. And Steve discusses in the report, that there's a wide variety of offices and agencies across the U.S. foreign assistance bureaucracy that are involved in providing democracy and governance assistance in the region. And I would say that facing that kind of situation, it was an absolute blessing to have that diversity of organizations, because each of them has different flavors, if you will, of resources available. They have different organizational capacities in terms of their ability to move funding, their ability to program funding, their ability to work flexibly on the ground. MEPI, in that situation, basically we tore up our spending plan for the year and reallocated and devoted $20 million out of what was then the end of FY10 funding to Tunisia, and within about a month and a half, we had programs starting to operate on the ground. And MEPI ended up ultimately, I think, devoting about $26 million of its own budget and then additional funding from the MRF to the Tunisian transition. So that's just a little snapshot. Let me try and hit a few broader issues. The first really is the budget environment. And Steve's report notes that funding for the Middle East in the FY13 budget actually increased when funding for every other region of the world declined. And that tells you about the priorities and about the really painful choices that have to be made when you're putting together a spending plan in such difficult economic circumstances like the ones that the United States is facing today. We managed to do a lot, as he said, with FY11 and FY12 funds, although, I did often feel like I was turning over the couch cushions to find transition assistance. We ultimately did pretty well. But over the longer term, democratic transitions take a while, and they need a real investment. And so in this environment, I think $700 million in new funding for Middle East North Africa Incentive Fund, plus the smaller increases that you see in some of the country accounts, is really quite significant. And I really want to underscore to you the opportunity cost. But the fact that you have this large a new initiative in the president's budget in this final year of the term, I think should demonstrate the level of commitment, the level of priority. It does require, this budget environment, though, does require that U.S. funding be used in ways that leverage our dollars for more, and that they be used creatively. And I think that you've seen that as well For example, the $30 million commitment by the U.S. for loan guarantees in Tunisia, when those loans were out on the market this past week, that resulted in almost $500 million in new resources for the Tunisian government. So $30 million U.S. investment paid off in spades. I think you could say the same about the enterprise funds, a very small upfront investment by the United States with the goal of supporting private sector growth and investment in the region over the long term. And I think it's that sort of creative, flexible, leveraging approach that is really at the heart of the Middle East North Africa Incentive Fund proposal. It's a way to invest in democratic and economic reform across the region that is flexible in its authorities to allow you to do things that you couldn't necessarily do with economic support funds, like certain types of security sector reform. It's a way of having the money in a regional fund rather than country specific. And I think this is important too, because first of all, we don't know where that funding is necessarily going to be most needed or be able to do the most good. And secondly, I think that one of the lessons that we can draw from assistance over the last years, and particularly efforts to try and condition assistance on certain policy choices, is that when you allocate funding by country, those countries have a certain set of expectations about that money. In fact, they start to think of it as their money, even though it's U.S. taxpayer money. And so allocating funds in a regional or a global pot, I think, avoids that problem and allows the U.S. government, when it wants to, put in place really what I would call, in the case of the MENA Incentive Fund, as in the case of the Millennium Challenge Corporation, a sort of positive, prospective kind of conditionality. If you make good choices, you might have access to these funds. It allows you to do that in a way that's not country specific, and I think that's important. I think, though, if you want to work in a budget-constrained environment and make new investments in democratic reform, you have to use some of the unique tools that the U.S. government has at its disposal. I think the MENA Incentive Fund is an effort to create a new tool specialized to circumstances, and I think the Middle East Partnership Initiative that I had the honor to head for a couple of years is another such unique tool. Steve mentioned the challenges that MEPI is facing in the Gulf states. I would actually say this is a broader problem. This is a problem that's not unique to the Gulf, but there's a global crackdown against civil society organizations. And there are a number of states in the Gulf that are part of that very unfortunate broader trend. So that the civil society organizations, the local organizations, and the local activists who are the most important actors on behalf of reform in the Middle East and anywhere else in the world are finding themselves very constrained in what they're able to do. And that means that MEPI and any other assistance program that wants to work with them is going to have a more difficult time doing that. But it's also clear that the trends, the region-wide trends, the deep societal trends in demography, in the information environment, in the economies, the trends that are driving demands for change in the region exist in the Gulf states just as they exist everywhere else. And so the pressures for change exist in the Gulf states too. And citizens in the states of the Arab Gulf have the same universal rights and the same demands as Arabs across the region. So I think that's something that we need to keep in mind. They deserve our partnership as much as the rest of the region does. Finally, I wanted to make a point about the balance question that Steve raised about the relative allocation of military and economic aid. And this is a very important question, I think, not only when you're talking about a concern for democracy and human rights, but more broadly in terms of where is the United States in the Middle East today. Having concluded a long military commitment in Iraq, shifting to a civilian partnership there, and really trying to reorient in many ways American engagement in the region, an effort that began well before the Arab Awakening with the president's speech in Cairo in June 2009, with all of that as context for the broad direction that the United States wants to go. And then layered on top of that, the fundamental changes taking place in the region itself, it's necessary to ask the question, do we have this balance right? What kind of profile does the United States want to have in its engagement with the people and the governments of the Middle East? There are real security interests for the United States at stake in the Middle East and North Africa. I certainly don't have to tell you that. And so there is a need for strong security cooperation and investments in sustaining that cooperation. But it's always worth looking at the balance. And I think that's something that that we had in mind the whole time I was in the department, and that I'm still thinking about today. So with that, I'll stop.
Okay. Thank you very much, Tamara, for your comments on the region. We'll turn over to Jennifer for any reactions to that, as well as your thoughts on comparisons in the early 90s to Eastern Europe and these kind of reactions.
Thank you. I can see now that going after this woman to my left was a strategic mistake. So, because I had all my points written down, and then she ticked off pretty much all of them. So, well, first of all, I want to join everybody in congratulating POMED and to say that I'm a strong believer from my time in aid, and it translated over to when I was at Freedom House, that looking at numbers does matter. It's only one tool, of course. There's a lot of other ways that the U.S. can influence events, but it does. The amount of dollars do indicate when policy shifts happen, the level of importance, and then how that money is allocated in terms of different strategic purposes is very important to watch. So it's also very difficult, and this is another reason I would congratulate POMED, to really get the numbers and the specifics underneath it, because there's lots of different ways that assistance is characterized in different pots, and so it's not an easy task. And as I said to Steve before this, there's a whole nother level of ground truthing in terms of talking to embassies and aid missions about what they're actually doing. So looking at what the U.S. government is doing in the State Department and AID at the Washington level, may or may not be, implemented or reflected in on-the-ground decisions by and attitudes by the U.S. government staff on the ground. So, just a little bit of a note. Tamara said that overall budget requests for other parts of the world decreased. Just Freedom House does a report looking at kind of big global picture related to budget, and at least in terms of requests for funds for democracy and governance, governing justly and democratically, I think is the category. The total request for worldwide was $2.8 billion, which seems like a big amount, which is actually an increase over last year. But now in that total request, this new incentive fund was not counted because it was not clear as to where it was going to be allocated. So, but still, that amount is only 8% of the total economic assistance budget. So you see a third of the funds in overall request going to security, and a third of the funds going to investing in people, and then there's a third of them going to investing in people, and then some other amounts going from economic growth and democracy. So, and then just again, trends in democracy assistance worldwide. You saw the South and Central Asia still continue to represent the lion's share of assistance in the democracy and governance area. You saw decreases in terms of Europe and Eurasia in terms of democracy assistance, and decreases in Western Hemisphere, and then small increases in Africa and East Asia. So again, just to sort of see how things go, it's also worthwhile. There has been a tendency, and it's been before this administration, to really focus a lot of money on conflict countries. Or countries coming out of conflict, et cetera. So 60% of the entire amount requested for democracy went to Afghanistan, or being requested went to Afghanistan, Iraq, Mexico, Pakistan, and Sudan. So always looking at, you broke out Iraq. That is one of the things I think that the U.S. government has, and it's beyond administrations. They tend to respond to crises better and with more money than to opportunities, and that perhaps is a major difference, actually, between now and the Seed and Freedom Support Act days when the fall of the Berlin Wall. There was absolutely a feeling that there was a massive change in that the U.S. had to, for security and strategic reasons, make sure that the transitions that were underway in Poland and Hungary and then elsewhere in the region succeeded. So the amounts of money that were put forward were quite considerable. I mean, I think Poland and Hungary alone was something like $900 million in the first year. And that was, some of the elements of that package, including the enterprise funds, you can see actually in some of the requests for the Middle East, but obviously the scale is quite different. But that also is important to say that that money also had strong congressional backing. So you had very strong congressional language on what those funds should be used for and how much assistance, should be going to what. So, and that we're not sure we have that in Congress right now. We do have very strong statements from Senator Kerry and on the Senate side that this is an historic opportunity. Frankly, we don't have that. We're not seeing that in terms of, from the House side, sort of the sense that this is something that the U.S. really has to respond to in a big way. And that's going to be problematic. The other thing I would say is that the mistaken assumption, it turns out, when we look back on how in 30 years, was that that with a massive infusion of money and assistance and policy dialogue, that the countries of Central and Eastern Europe and then former Soviet Union would transform overnight. And so part of the thinking behind these massive amounts of money was that actually that within 5 years, or 10 years, there would be no need for that assistance. And that's true perhaps for some countries, but if you even look at Hungary today, for instance, there's been quite a significant backsliding on freedom of expression issues in a country that we thought was, in fact, secured. That doesn't happen. And I don't think anybody is thinking that the transitions that are going on in the Middle East are going to be short-term. We were wrong in many, many countries. And in fact, I think the Eurasia examples might be more relevant to look at than Central and Eastern Europe, because you had kind of you had a transition, but you didn't have a transformation in a lot of countries. And it was one set of elites transferring to another set of elites, or reconsidering who they are. And so we don't know yet how much there's going to be real transitions that are occurring in these countries. And Egypt, of course, is on everybody's mind. There's all this discussion about the role of the military, but you also have the role of the Muslim Brotherhood. And, it's a real open question as to whether the Muslim Brotherhood is going to play by democratic rules or is going to continue to be a champion of democracy and human rights once they're in power. Once you're in power, it tends to change your perspective somewhat as to how much you want to tolerate that. There was a story, I think, about the state media in Egypt, and would the state-appointed leaders of the major media outlets be swapped with Muslim Brotherhood sort of appointed candidates, and what was that going to lead to in terms of democracy and human rights? So, there's not, in many of these places, there's not a clear-cut good guys and bad guys, pro-democracy elements and pro or anti-democracy elements. So it's it's a complex policy environment, and from a democracy sort of advocate perspective, I would always say administrations never do enough. And I have been a critic of the early days of the Obama administration. I think it significantly regained its sea legs in terms of embracing democracy and human rights, especially rhetorically, and has made some important steps forward. But I also still feel like it tends to be, in response to things that are happening in the region, which frankly, historically also has been the case. I mean, when I started working in the government, I worked on Africa, and when I stepped into the Africa Bureau in 1991, I was told that Africa was not ready for democracy issues, that there should be no funds allocated to Africa for this because Africans wanted a strong leader, and then it was the voices and the actions of Africans themselves that just literally pushed the U.S. government into a position. So it is hard for the U.S. government and other governments to be proactive in these issues. So I just want to say I agree completely with the balance of military assistance and the difficulties of it. I cannot say how unhappy I was with the waiver decision in Egypt. I think the overall U.S.-Egypt relations and what the administration sort of is looking for and aiming for in terms of its relations with Egypt is completely unclear to me. They send continuous conflicting signals, and I think that's a real problem given the importance that Egypt plays in the area. I will also say that, the Gulf is, what you're seeing in the Gulf in terms of reaction by governments is complete paranoia. And they, unlike other parts of the region, have the resources to try to buy off their citizens. But how long that's going to work is an open question. But so far, I would say that, we do focus a lot on Egypt, but not as much on, the fact that UAE threw out countries. And so this crackdown on civil society in Egypt could well be seen as being replicated across the board. Just lastly, I'll say that the key issue of civil society, so how much in this incentive fund should it be approved will be going to civil society versus assisting governments. If it's modeled on the MCC, that money goes to governments. Technically, they're supposed to consult with civil society, but in practice, that has not actually been very real in my circumstances. So there'd be a question of sort of how would civil society benefit from this assistance? I can't tell from the request. And also, just one aspect of this region, in particular, Egypt, has been the ability of governments to veto the assistance, where the assistance goes. And that is just something that I think that we cannot accept. I'm all for country ownership when the governments and the countries are democratically elected, that they are clearly committed to the rule of law and inclusive participation. I'm not sure we're seeing that in countries in the Middle East to the extent that we need it so far, and we certainly need to be able to judge when that's the case and have the ability, as the U.S. government needs to maintain the ability to actually continue to assist civil society. I think I'll end by saying sort of there's clearly a sense in Congress that perhaps the U.S. government won't be able to do that. And you can see that by the increased request for resources for the NED. So as we go forward, what's the role of the State Department, USAID, the different mechanisms, and the NED, and how each entity is able to respond to this and how they're going to be constrained is going to be critical to look at in the future.
Great. Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you to all our speakers. We've got certainly a lot of things out on the table to frame our discussion. While I'm giving the audience just a minute to brainstorm their questions, I just want to see, Steve, if you had anything to add or react, particularly about the Middle East and North Africa Incentive Fund.
Yes, sure. I sort of mistakenly skipped over my notes on what I was going to say about the Middle East and North Africa Incentive Fund. I'm glad that Tamara spoke quite a bit about it, and I'll kind of add to that a little bit more. I mean, I do think, it's sort of a really important, potentially important signature initiative of the administration. I think it's really sort of the most kind of distinctive new thing in this budget request and that's been put forward. To make a few remarks about it, I mean, first, the overall amount, $700 million. There's been some reactions that that's a lot of money, or it's a lot of new money to be requesting at this time. I consider it to actually be quite modest and not that much. I mean, if you look, the U.S. administration has already mobilized more than that, roughly $800 million in the past 18 months, in order to respond to the transitions that are underway. But they've had to do that by, as Tamara described, digging under the couch cushions and kind of pulling amounts from lots of different accounts and lots of different pots of money. I have the sense that the more they do that, the harder it is to do, and that as time goes by, in the next year there may not be as much money in different accounts that they can continue to pull from. The Middle East North African Incentive Fund has its first overall purpose. The main purpose of the majority of the funds is to reward countries that are willing to undertake serious reform. That's similar to the MCC, except it's quite explicitly supposed to be much more focused on not only economic reform, but especially primarily political reform, where the MCC really just looks at economic reform. There is, in response to Jennifer's question or comment, I mean, it is a stated intention to also support civil society, not only governments. I think some here on the Hill have been somewhat uncomfortable with the fact that it's not all broken down by exactly how much money would go where, but I think that's inevitable. I mean, I think you can't avoid that. We can't know where exactly all the funds are going to be needed. I think the idea of trying to reward the countries that are willing to undertake reform is admirable. In addition to that, the second purpose of the fund is also to provide kind of emergency response funds to replace the Middle East Response Fund that was set up a year ago. About $210 million has been put into that fund in the past year. It's obvious that a lot more money is going to be needed in sort of emergency, to respond to events in the region. It's seeming increasingly likely that Syria, may enter its own transition and may need enormous resources. Syria is a country, with a population more than that of Tunisia and Libya combined. In Tunisia and Libya, we've mobilized about $600 million, in the last 18 months. So it's not unreasonable that we might need, that much or more, even just for Syria alone. So I think the idea that $700 million is too much to be granted to a new fund, to me, doesn't make sense. And one last note, I mean, there's been sort of mixed reaction so far from, I didn't really talk at all in my remarks about sort of reaction from Congress. So far, in the House Appropriations bill that was approved by the Appropriations Committee, no funds were given to this Middle East North African Incentive Fund. They instead gave a couple $100 million to a Middle East Response Fund. I think that would be a grave mistake to not support this initiative. I think if it were not supported, it would have sort of dire consequences to the administration's ability to kind of respond to events over the next year. The Senate, on the other hand, in its bill that was approved by the Appropriations Committee, granted $1 billion. So more than requested. I think that's appropriate, and I hope that we'll see in the months ahead, when they have to kind of reconcile these two bills, see this fund kind of fully supported.
Can I just add that, again, on a historical perspective, that this, the need for flexibility has been in a regional context and a global context has been sort of the ongoing effort of administrations, I think, probably since the time. But, that was something that was actually quite interesting about the SEED and Freedom Support Act funds is that they were regional funds to begin with. While they started with Poland and Hungary, and there was a reporting, oftentimes Congress says, well, we need country amounts so that we can further track it, but there was a reporting requirement sort of on a yearly basis. Then Congress was apprised of exactly where that money went, which again gives a flexibility up front, but still gives Congress the ability to say what exactly did you spend in which country. And so I do think and agree that that giving that kind of regional flexibility is very, very important, and certainly as best practices from the past.
Okay, thank you. At this time, we'd like to open up the floor for questions. If you have a question, I think we have a couple roaming mics going around. If you could just identify yourself, your affiliation, and if your question is directed to any speaker in particular, please indicate as such.
Hi, thank you for coming today and speaking with us. I'm an intern with Senator Hagan's office, but I just came back from 6 months in Egypt. And the way the democracy is developing there may be very different from what we consider to be democracy here. Like the role of women in society, role of civil society groups, as the Muslim Brotherhood and the military are kind of working things out. Ms. Witz, you mentioned that democratic transitions take a long time to occur. How can our government have the patience and tolerance for, as these new democracies develop in ways that we might not have intended, we may not approve, but that we still need to support for, in the long run? Thank you.
I think there were a couple more right here, so let's go ahead and just take the right. Yeah, thank you.
Danya Greenfield with the Hariri Center at the Atlantic Council. Thank you all very much, Steve. Great report again this year. I just wanted to make a comment and two questions. One is I agree completely that the U.S.-Egyptian bilateral relationship needs to be restructured and rethought of. Having just returned from Egypt and a meeting with the SCAF, it's clear that there's absolutely no appetite whatsoever to do that rethink right now, both on the part of the SCAF and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So as much as we may want to recast that relationship and potentially shift resources from military assistance to economic assistance, that would be vehemently opposed. So I agree it's something we need to pursue. How we go about doing that in a context where it's not going to be welcomed on the other side, I think is going to be a significant challenge. Two questions. One is you mentioned that the shifting of resources that happened, through the Murph account and other mechanisms was not actually reflective of any change of policy. And I'm wondering if you think that was an oversight or if there were missed opportunities where different decisions should have been made, where policies should have actually changed in terms of how funding decisions were made or what types of programs were invested in. And my second question is actually about, more to Tamara and Jennifer, about the issue of conditionality and to the extent that this is actually going to be an effective tool in helping to encourage and promote reform. I'm specifically thinking of Secretary Clinton's decision to invoke the waiver and how effective will our ability to use this conditionality and sort of reward progress when, if threats are made to withhold funding, they're not carried forth or they're not followed through on. So thank you very much.
Okay. Maybe Tamara, if you want to start with the Egypt question and conditionality.
Sure. So if the question is how can the United States find the strategic patience, if you will, to ride out a bumpy transition in a state that is strategically important and has been an important ally, I guess I would say a couple of things. One is that it's not as though we've never done this before. The United States embraced ultimately and supported democratic transitions in South Korea, in the Philippines, in Taiwan, after periods of supporting autocratic government quite robustly. And this is something we can manage. It's tricky, it's not fun, but it's necessary. And I don't think that the United States is going to turn its back on a democratic transition, even if it produces some medium-term strategic complications. But to the question of, democracies that might not look like us, I do think it's important for the United States, while it engages with the newly elected leaders in these countries, in Egypt and elsewhere, to be very clear about what those universal rights are that are core components of democratic governance. Secretary Clinton says constantly that democracy is not just elections, but what does that mean exactly? This is not a set of, American-style democracy or British-style democracy. That's really getting more at questions of, are you a presidential or parliamentary system? That's not most relevant. We have a set of internationally, universally embraced principles for democratic governance. There are functioning democracies in every region of the world representing just about every culture and religion you could imagine, and they all share some common features, which are not only elected leaders, but also core political rights, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of association, and equality of all citizens under the law. And I think that, the United States government has been and needs to continue to articulate those universal principles quite clearly in its engagement with newly elected leaders, not as American expectations, but as core components of democratic governance. Conditionality. The thing about legislatively imposed conditions, it's twofold. Number one, they're retrospective. So, okay, we're allocating the money, but if you don't do X, Y, and Z, we're going to take it away. So it's a sanction, in effect. And that means it produces some of the same kind of countervailing sentiment on the part of the target as an economic sanction would. Okay, it's the other thing, of course, is that it's a one-shot deal. It is an effort by those who create the conditionality to create leverage for the U.S. government in inducing policy change. But if it becomes clear that the policy change is not coming, in other words, if the threat does not have effect, you either carry it out or you don't. But once you do that, the leverage is gone. It doesn't work anymore. And that's the dilemma. And I think that's why models of prospective conditionality are increasingly attractive. Look, these are our taxpayer dollars. We get to decide how we're going to spend them. And we're going to spend them in accordance with our interests, in accordance with lessons that we've learned about what makes for effective development, including democratic governance, and in accordance with our principles and values. And if you're cool with that, here's money. It's available. So I think that we don't have a long track record yet on the MCC. And the MENA incentive fund is a slightly different structure because it's providing money in response to commitments rather than in response to past behavior. But I think that it's a model that is very compelling precisely because of the weaknesses that are obvious in the effectiveness of that sort of retrospective conditionality.
Yes, I mean, I completely agree. The term of art in terms of prospective conditionality is selectivity, as part of. So that's yes. So which is you're actually making choices about where you think you're going to get most bang for your buck. So, and that, is important. Now, that's different than the conditionality of that's in the bill to say, is Egypt committed, Congress said, is Egypt sufficiently committed to human rights and democracy, and only then should, the military assistance go forward, and then sort of waiving that. You're right. That kind of conditionality, it still may, looking back at it for sort of 25 years, is still possibly, even if the waiver happens, may encourage some changes or some, maybe not the whole, there might be some human rights movement forward that you could see in particular issues. But, and as, I think Steve said, is that there was a lot of other options on the table. I mean, there was, during the Bush administration, $30 million of some military assistance that was supposed to be added to Egypt was withheld when Ayman Noor, I think, was, yeah. So
it was Sadadim.
Oh, Sadadim, yeah. So and Secretary Rice didn't go to Egypt at one point because Ayman Noor was in prison. So, I think that there was a lot of modulated responses where the U.S. can still send the signal that it cares about these issues and got certain agreements, et cetera. So, again, I don't think that even if they're ultimately unsuccessful, I still think it's important for Congress to be asking these questions and putting this kind of language in the bills, because that always has been, most of the time, Congress is pushing the administration, every administration, on sort of being more tough on human rights, et cetera. And it helps, frankly, from having been in the U.S. government and to have Congress and other groups outside sort of holding your feet to the fire, even if you can't. So it strengthens those within the U.S. government whose job it is to try to put more emphasis on democracy and human rights, to have those kind of outside levers.
Let's see, Don, your question about policy shift, or what would I like to have seen in terms of seeing more of a policy shift to accompany the reallocation of funds. I mean, I would say there were policy shifts, but not everywhere, in a few countries. And, you know, I think in terms of what I would like to have seen, I'd like to have seen a more consistent, coherent vision. And consistent doesn't mean like do the identical thing in every country, but I think it comes through whether the same kind of vision and commitment is reflected. And the kind of policy shift that I would have liked to have seen, I think, was actually spelled out quite well by President Obama in his speech of May of last year, and he said that support for democratic principles will no longer be a secondary interest in the region. And I think you can tell, there's no formula for how that has to happen, but you can tell whether it is being kind of treated as secondary to other strategic interests. I think, to kind of come back to Tunisia, I think that's an example where it's clear that it's a real priority, and support for the transition is not being deflected or kind of forgotten for the sake of other strategic interests. But across much of the rest of the region, that's not the case. And I would have liked to have seen stronger support for democracy in Morocco, and kind of maybe an increase and we have a very small, modest program there. I think there'd be room to really both augment the levels of funding and then also kind of have greater political will, and there's been no evidence of it. There was a program in Bahrain that was underway to try to foster dialogue between different sides and to build consensus. And that would be at the top of the list of the kind of things that's now needed in Bahrain, but instead that was brought to an end and is not continued. I mean, partly in reaction to kind of government pushback, but I would have liked to have seen not given to government pushback in that example. In Egypt, I would have liked to have seen the stand by the commitment and the conditions put forward that yes, we want to give aid to the military, yes, we want a strong relationship, but we will do so once you've met these conditions of the democratic transition. I mean, to me, explicitly, what happened is that we said, no, we're going to put, we'd like to see a democratic transition. We'd like to see the progress that Congress has laid out, but we're willing to waive those conditions in the interest of national security. And to me, that violates kind of this vision of not, allowing it to be secondary to other interests. I would like to have seen, support for, diminishing kind of interest in democracy and governance in Lebanon and in the West Bank and Gaza not continue to diminish, to kind of see that trend kind of reverse itself in reaction to what's happening in the region. And this extends beyond just funding and programs, but also to kind of policy statements. To take another example, Algeria recently had elections that by according to most observers, international observers, were fraudulent elections. They were not good elections, but we didn't object. We didn't say anything about them, and we kind of reverted to the old playbook and had kind of modest praise for them having elections, and then complimented them on the state of women's rights, and sounded exactly like what we used to say before the revolutions. And I would like to see kind of the transformation that we've had in Tunisia and Libya kind of extend across the region.
Hi, I'm Carrie Diener with Mercy Corps. I was really surprised to hear your perspective on Libya. I mean, as an operational agency on the ground, we've actually found investments to be quite slim and interest, in fact, waning. So I was wondering if you could highlight or elaborate a little bit more on what you've seen as a successful investment portfolio there. Thanks.
I'm Sarah Trister with Freedom House. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about sequestration and how that might affect the budgets going forward, particularly in the region, and for Tamara, how people in the State Department and USAID are preparing for those possibilities.
My name's Nadia Dar with the Bank Information Center here in D.C. I'm wondering, we've heard speckled rumors that the U.S. is going to be hosting the upcoming donor conference for Yemen in September, and wondering if anyone's heard anything and what role the U.S. would be playing in terms of coordination and leveraging dollars for Yemen non-military aid.
Okay, thank you. Maybe, Steve, if you want to start this time with the first question on interest and funding in Libya waning, we can go to tomorrow on sequestration, and then anyone that would like to weigh in on Yemen.
Sure. On Libya, yeah, I mean, I think there is a sense that more funds to Libya would be helpful than what has been allocated. As far as waning, I think we're also sort of at a period where a lot of the focus of the Democracy and Governance funds was for the elections, which now just took place, and in terms of productive funds that we've seen there, I do think that a lot of really important, valuable funding was put forth to help the elections that just took place come off for the National Congress, as well as some local elections that took place before that. Not only direct support for kind of running and administrating the elections, which was extraordinary challenge in Libya, also support for a variety of civil society organizations undertaking election monitoring, support and training for political parties, which has been provided in other countries undergoing transitions, but was more needed, kind of more sorely needed in Libya than anywhere else. I mean, the political parties had really zero capacity. I mean, to any political party, and civil society as well. I mean, it has extremely limited capacity. And I think there are quite a number of kind of productive programs that have been supported, and that there was, I think it was, close to adequate or what was needed in many respects during the last several months, and kind of in preparation for these really important elections, which came off better than anyone was imagining several months ago. And there were a lot of fears. I was in Libya. I did a trip to Libya, not my recent trip, but before that, and people were very afraid about what elections, how are they going to come off, and there's lots of arms in the country, and if people that don't win are armed, how will they react? And in general, those elections are a success, and I think the U.S. played a modest but important role in kind of supporting that. I think now it's not clear exactly. I mean, I think there's still continued interest in supporting Libya's transition beyond these elections, but I think maybe now there's a moment where the strategy or kind of the focus is not as clear as it was before the elections. But I'm hopeful that the support there will continue.
Okay. Whoops. First, quickly on Libya, I think it's important to remember that until last October, we were dealing with a conflict situation. And so a lot of the transition assistance allocated to Libya in the initial tranche, quite appropriately, was for dealing with humanitarian and other outcomes from the conflict, refugee relief, food aid, hygiene kits, all that kind of basic stuff, which is not cheap, by the way. And so there was also then, while the conflict was still ongoing and afterwards, investments made in democracy and governance support. Long before we knew there were going to be elections this summer, we knew that there were emerging local governance institutions, there were emerging civil society organizations on the ground, there were emerging political parties. And I think one of the things we did well was get on the ground early wherever we could to try and help the Libyan population put into place the sort of basic social infrastructure necessary to make a democratic transition possible. But as Libya moves on from that period of conflict and post-conflict, it is a wealthy country. It's a country with a lot of energy resources. And the main resource to fund reconstruction, development, and democratic growth in Libya is going to come from the Libyan government. I think the role of the international community, including the United States, is to make investments in places like civil society where the Libyan government either can't or won't make those same investments. On sequestration on the Yemen donor conference, I can be very brief. I really don't know on either. I left the government at the end of January, so the sequestration wasn't really on the agenda then.
You want to weigh in on Yemen? Or?
Yeah, I mean, I also don't know about hosting. I also don't know about hosting the donor conference. I do think the U.S. is going to play an important role, whether they host a conference or not, and that they're very interested. And I think interest in kind of the priority internally with the administration on Yemen has clearly been sort of increasing, and I expect that to continue. So I expect them to play an important role, whether they host or not.
Okay. A few additional questions. There's a hand way in the very back here.
Good afternoon. My name is Tom Ploufjon with the Cairo Review of Global Affairs. First and foremost, thank you very much for this presentation and for your work, Stephen. It's a great contribution to the field. One observation and then a question. My observation being, I've lived in Cairo for the past 2 years. I've been working and studying there. And one thing that I've noticed going to the balance question that you raised, Tamara, is that the average Egyptian citizen doesn't even know there is aid to Egypt. And I think that makes a strong point about what we're doing and the balance between economic and military aid, not only in Egypt, but also in other parts of the region that I've visited. So just as an observation for someone who's been there a lot lately, I think that weighs strongly to your point that it needs to be reconsidered. And then secondly, a balanced question in a different aspect is I look at the countries that we've talked about today, and one that we give a lot of aid to that is missing is Israel. And obviously, Israel has a different relationship in a certain sense than some of these other countries with the United States. But I wonder, given the changes that have occurred in the past year, year and a half, and which hopefully will be occurring, do you all think that this may be the time to start including discussions and conversations about budget and analysis in the region, on the regional level, as you mentioned, Tamara, including Israel with these conversations with these Arab countries as well, and trying to get a more regional perspective? Thank you.
Hi, Noreen Hawk from IFAS. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about Syria. You mentioned that there's going to be funding possibly from the MRF, but I was wondering, in light of U.S. strategic and security interests, what that aid would look like, and if there were any other lessons learned from the other transitioning countries for Syria.
I'm Ben Schwartz from the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom. I'm wondering whether any of you are expecting what changes, if any, that a Romney administration would take to promoting democracy in the Middle East.
Okay. I think maybe since we're sort of coming toward the end, I'll leave it open to any of these topics that you all like to address and any sort of closing and final words that you'd like to offer as well. Start here with Jennifer.
Okay. Well, interesting perspectives on Egypt. I think that's probably right. There was never, I actually was first in Egypt in 1985, and I think even then there wasn't a lot of recognition of what, where the U.S. government was. So, it's been mainly a relationship between the governments of the United States and a government of Egypt. And so if we are to take the Obama administration, we need relationships between our societies and people in that, and that's the only way you're going to get sort of a change in perspective. Well, I have no idea about a Romney administration. It's they seem to be spending most of their time not, both, the incumbent always kind of present as he seems to be going away from foreign policy. I would say that there's a general cry for doing more on Syria, and sort of saying, and more on Iran, et cetera. But how that would manifest itself, it looks really different when you're actually in government as opposed to on the campaign trail. So a nice soundbite, in any administration, nice soundbite before, and what you actually do when you get in and you have the reality, hard to tell. So, but I would hope that, as we've seen and this really starts with, if you come from President Carter human rights policy, every administration when it came to power had sort of put democracy and human rights issues sort of lower on its radar screen at the beginning, and then events pushed them into actually having to grapple with those issues. It would be great if generally any change in administration would not have to be, I'm against democracy and human rights because the last administration did something on it. So I really hope that we could just, agree that this is a bipartisan priority. It's not something that's going to go away, and sort of keep on building of the successes from the past and learn from the failures.
Okay, first, Brookings is actually going to sponsor a panel with representatives from the Romney and Obama campaigns next Wednesday afternoon on foreign policy in advance of Romney's trip. So come to that, and you can ask that question of a Romney advisor. Let me work backwards. Considering Israel as part of the mix, I think we do consider Israel part of the mix, both in terms of the overall assistance picture and in terms of democracy and human rights. MEPI works in Israel as it works in every other country of the region except Iran, where we have no diplomatic relations. I don't see a failure to bring it into the picture. And, I think when we're talking about the military to economic aid balance, it's certainly included in the overall ratios, and the ratio is over 3 to 1 region-wide. It's quite disproportionate. You noted that citizens in Egypt don't feel or see the impact of American assistance. And as Jennifer said, I think that's consequent to an assistance strategy that was about a government-to-government relationship. It's also about the nature of what the U.S. has funded over the years. But fundamentally, it's, I think, this NGO crisis, which, as Steve's report notes very well, has been brewing for years, is reflective of what's going on here, which is that from the perspective of the government of Egypt prior to the revolution and this transitional government, our economic assistance should be allocated in a way that they can control and they can benefit from. And the objections to American independent funding of Egyptian civil society organizations, even organizations that are doing economic development work, is about a lack of control. The Egyptian government prior to the revolution was extremely concerned about having independent civil society activity because it was a threat to that government's autonomy. And so the fact that Egyptian citizens don't see or feel American assistance, I think, we might want to treat that as a little bit of an indicator of the legacies of our relationship and of where we need to go. Let me close with one final broader point that I really, if you take nothing else from what I said today, take this. It's a really, really terrible economic time globally. It's a really terrible budget environment in Washington. It's a political year. There are all kinds of reasons why the foreign assistance budget this year is going to face unprecedented challenges. And you hear every time foreign aid comes under pressure, you will hear people making arguments that this is the smartest investment in American interests and American security abroad that the U.S. can make. And all of that is true. Nowhere is it more true than in the Middle East right now. And the core realization that we should all draw from the Arab awakening in terms of U.S. interests is that none of the interests we want to pursue in the Middle East, counterterrorism, counterproliferation, Arab-Israeli peace, none of these things are possible in the absence of regional stability. Regional stability is not going to return to this region until governments reform or transform to reflect the will and aspirations of their people. That's the lesson of the Arab awakening. So in this region, at this moment, it is more true than it's ever been that investing in democracy and governance assistance is investing in our security interests. And I certainly hope that that can be a matter of bipartisan understanding.
Let's see. Briefly on Egypt, I think that's generally accurate that most Egyptians have no idea that U.S. money comes into the country, or at least didn't as of a year ago. Now a lot of Egyptians think that money comes into the country from the U.S. to insidious, mysterious organizations that seek to undermine security and stability in Egypt because they've heard that on state media and by officials kind of related to this NGO crisis over the past year. And I've had lots of discussions with people in Egypt who won't believe me when I say that the amount going to kind of civil society organizations is a few percent, and the overwhelming majority is $1.3 billion in military aid, and no one knows that in Egypt hardly that money is going, and no one in the government there talks about it. In Syria, in terms of what might the U.S. role be, I think if Assad were to be overthrown, I think the U.S. would very quickly, immediately have serious concerns. I think many of the kinds of things that you would see in Syria would be somewhat similar to what we've seen in Libya over the past year, and in the sense that there'd be a real focus on trying to secure weapons, including chemical weapons, very quickly. There'd be a focus on securing borders and trying to prevent escalation of local conflict and reprisals, especially against the Alawite community. And then there would be the kind of focus on supporting the political transition that we've seen in Libya, and also in quite clearly in Tunisia, and to some degree also in Egypt, where would be trying to Syria would be similar to Libya and in many respects Tunisia, and the fact that the capacity of civil society organizations and political parties is essentially non-existent. And so there'd be a strong desire to very quickly work with both independent actors of different kinds in Syria and work with whatever institutions come about to kind of govern in the interim to provide support and ensure that kind of the stability of that transition.
Okay. Well, thank you all very much. I certainly want to thank everyone for coming today. We hope that this report is a very useful resource for you, and this discussion has certainly triggered some thoughts of how to move forward on these issues. Definitely keep in touch with us regarding these issues on U.S. policy and how we can best support human rights and democracy in the region. And please join me in giving a final thank you, round of applause, our speakers, Steve McInerney, Tamara Wittes, Jennifer Windsor.